On an ordinary autumn evening in October 1957, Americans stepped out onto porches, into backyards and darkened fields, and looked up at the sky. Somewhere up there, beyond the blue they were used to and into the black they almost never thought about, a tiny artificial star was crossing overhead, beeping its steady, mocking signal. It was called Sputnik, and it did not belong to the United States. It belonged to the Soviet Union. Just 12 years after American industry and science had crushed Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, the idea that the first object in space would be stamped with a red star hit like a punch to the gut. The country that had built the atomic bomb, the long-range bomber, the mass-produced jet, suddenly found itself watching its great rival fly overhead, circling the entire planet every 96 minutes. For ordinary Americans, hearing those beeps rebroadcast on the radio and seeing headlines the next morning, it felt as if someone had moved the finish line of history while they were still celebrating their last victory. Before Sputnik, most Americans took it for granted that the United States sat comfortably at the top of the technological food chain. The narrative made sense. This was the country that had unlocked the power of the atom, lit entire cities, filled driveways with shiny cars and highways with coast-to-coast traffic. Magazines showed gleaming concept cars, push-button kitchens, and artists' visions of future space stations, with the quiet assumption that, of course, when humanity finally left Earth, it would be under the American flag. The Soviets did not fit that picture. In American eyes, they were the gray, drab superpower, long lines for bread, few consumer goods, no blue jeans, a place where propaganda posters promised utopia, but Western journalists saw hardship and scarcity. If the United States was the world of chrome, neon, and television, the Soviet Union was supposed to be a land of cement blocks and tractors. And yet, on October 4th, 1957, it was that backwards system that put a polished metal sphere in orbit, humming over New York, Kansas, and California. Sputnik 1 itself was a simple machine, a little over half a meter across, with 4 long antennas jutting outward, about 83 kilograms of aluminum sphere and radio gear. It did not carry a camera, a scientific laboratory, or a human pilot. Its entire purpose, beyond a small experiment on the density of the atmosphere, was to exist up there and announce every time it passed, "We did it first." It was enough. The real payload was psychological. Newspapers seized on the story immediately. Morning editions hit doorsteps with headlines like "Reds fire Earth satellite into space," "Soviet satellite circles globe," and "U.S. left behind in race to space." Reporters explained that the same kind of rocket which could lift a satellite into orbit could, in theory, hurl a nuclear warhead across continents. That turned a scientific milestone into a direct question about national survival. If the Soviets could do this, what else could they do? How long before a warhead followed that beeping metal ball? In living rooms, people turned on radios to hear the recorded beep, beep, beep of Sputnik's signal. It was eerie. The sound was thin and simple, but it carried a weight completely out of proportion to its tone. That little pulse said Soviet engineers had solved the puzzle of getting into orbit. They had built a booster powerful enough to escape the atmosphere and precise enough to hit the right speed. For Americans, used to thinking of their country as the one that led in every meaningful technology, it felt like the other team had just scored on the very first play. Politicians and commentators poured out their reactions. Some tried to downplay the event, insisting it was just a football in the sky. Others were blunt, calling it a national humiliation. Editorials questioned whether American schools were teaching enough math and science, whether the culture had gone soft, more focused on tail fins and television than on hard engineering. One widely quoted joke from Moscow, "Your engineers make the best car fins, ours make the best missiles," stung far more than Americans wanted to admit. In Washington, President Dwight Eisenhower faced a delicate problem. Behind closed doors, he knew the United States was not as far behind as the headlines suggested. American labs were working on their own rockets and satellites. Military programs like Atlas and Polaris were moving quietly ahead. But political reality cared more about perception than classified memos. The Soviet Union had just pulled off a global propaganda coup, and the world had noticed. The pressure only increased a month later when the Soviets followed up with Sputnik 2. This one was larger, more complex, and carried a living passenger, a dog named Laika. Pictures of the dog splashed across front pages. Soviet newsreels proudly showed the capsule. For millions around the world, it was as if the USSR was ticking off milestones American science was supposed to claim first. First satellite, first living creature in orbit. The red star just kept rising. Then came a particularly painful moment. In December 1957, the United States staged its own highly public attempt to launch a satellite, Vanguard TV-3. TV cameras rolled, the rocket rose a few feet off the pad, and then collapsed back in a ball of fire and twisted metal, live on national television. While Soviet launches had been announced after success, this American failure unfolded in real time, further feeding the sense that the country had stumbled in full view of the world. Soviet commentators had a field day. Cartoons in their press showed an American rocket falling over like a drunk. At home, late-night comedians made dark jokes. But beneath the laughter was something more serious, a feeling that the United States had allowed itself to be surprised. The nation of engineers had been caught flat-footed by an opponent it constantly described as clumsy and rigid. That hurt the national ego. And when egos hurt at the level of superpowers, big things happen. Very quickly, the discussion in America moved from "how did they beat us" to "what are we going to do about it?" Newspapers and magazines ran long pieces about the Sputnik crisis. They asked whether American children were falling behind in mathematics, whether curricula were outdated, whether federal funding for basic science was too low. Members of Congress began holding hearings, grilling military officers and scientists about rocket programs and satellite plans. The phrase "missile gap" entered the political vocabulary, suggesting that the United States might soon face an enemy with more and better nuclear-armed rockets. To be clear, that gap was often exaggerated. Later intelligence would reveal that Soviet strength in missiles was not as overwhelming as some critics claimed. But in the late 1950s, perception drove policy. The sight of Sputnik crossing the sky and the sound of its beeping on the radio created a simple image anyone could grasp. The Soviets were up there, we were not. In a democracy where voters and television audiences mattered, that image mattered more than any classified assessment. The American response unfolded on several fronts at once. First, there was the immediate technological catch-up. In January 1958, the United States successfully launched its first satellite, Explorer 1, atop a Juno 1 rocket led by Werner Braun's team. The small cylinder carried scientific instruments that would discover the Van Allen radiation belts, an early reminder that when America got into the game, it aimed not just to match a feat, but to expand knowledge. Explorer 1 did not erase the sting of Sputnik, but it signaled that the United States was now in the arena. More importantly, U.S. leaders decided that space and advanced technology needed a permanent, focused institutional home. In the summer of 1958, Congress passed the National Aeronautics and Space Act, and NASA was born. NASA gathered pieces of earlier agencies and research centers under one roof with a clear mission: ensure that the United States would not just participate in spaceflight, but lead it. For American audiences today, NASA's logo and history are symbols of national pride, but it's worth remembering that this agency exists in its current form because the beeping of Sputnik forced Washington to move. Alongside NASA came another, less publicly glamorous creation, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, or ARPA, inside the Department of Defense.
While NASA focused on the civil side, ARPA was tasked with pushing the frontiers of military-relevant technology, satellites, missiles, communications, and years later, the computer networks that would evolve into the Internet. Here again, the shock of a Soviet satellite lit a fire under American bureaucracy. If the Soviets could surprise the world from above, the United States would build an entire machine devoted to making sure it never suffered that kind of surprise again.
The second front of the response reached into every classroom. In 1958, Congress passed the National Defense Education Act. On its surface, it was an education bill. In reality, it was a strategic weapon. The law poured federal money into science, math, and foreign language education. It funded new textbooks, lab equipment, and scholarships. The very name, Defense Education Act, reflected the mindset. The front line of the Cold War now included physics teachers and calculus classes. Suddenly, American parents were told that their children's homework was part of national security. Math scores became a matter of patriotism. School districts updated curricula, introduced more rigorous science programs, and encouraged advanced placement courses. High school students who might previously have drifted into other fields were now hearing that becoming an engineer or physicist was not just a good career, but service to their country. For many American viewers remembering their youth in the late 1950s and 1960s, that pressure and encouragement left a deep mark. On the cultural level, Sputnik sparked a wave of science fascination. Magazines put scientists on their covers. Children's books and comic strips suddenly featured rockets, astronauts, and far-off planets. Television shows ran segments explaining orbits, gravity, and rocketry to curious audiences. Science fiction, which had been a niche interest, pushed closer to the mainstream, mixing real physics with imagined futures. Beneath it all was a new understanding. Technology was not just cool, it was existential. Whoever owned the high ground of space would shape the future. Allies in Western Europe watched this drama with a mix of admiration and concern. On one hand, they were impressed by Soviet engineering and worried by the thought of Soviet missiles able to reach both American and European cities. On the other hand, they saw the furious American reaction and knew that a massive wave of U.S. innovation was coming. NATO strategists understood that the balance of power was about to be renegotiated above their heads, in orbit as much as on the ground. In Moscow, meanwhile, leaders basked in the glow of their achievement. Soviet media hailed Sputnik as proof that socialism could out-invent capitalism. They boasted to newly independent countries in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East that the Soviet model could carry them from peasants to spacefarers in a single generation. For a brief, intoxicating moment, it looked like history might be turning their way. The red moon seemed to cast its light over a world where Washington no longer held an undisputed monopoly on the future. But if Soviet planners were proud, they were not blind. They could see the American response building, the emergency funding, the reorganization, the quiet, high-level meetings. They knew that the United States had deeper industrial resources and a broader base of universities and laboratories than they did. Sputnik had given them an early lead in one dramatic category. It had not guaranteed they would stay in front. In retrospect, that is what makes this story so compelling for American audiences. The launch of Sputnik is often presented as a moment of pure humiliation, a time when the United States discovered that it was not automatically number one, and it was a shock. But what came next is the part that evokes pride, fascination, and curiosity. Because when you look at the long arc from 1957 to the end of the 1960s, you see a country that took a punch and then responded with one of the greatest bursts of technological and organizational energy in human history. Within a few years, the world saw the Gemini program putting Americans in orbit for longer durations, testing rendezvous and docking. It saw Apollo missions orbiting the moon, then landing on it. And in July 1969, the same Earth that had stared up in astonishment at a little Soviet sphere in 1957 watched American astronauts plant their flag in lunar dust. For Soviet leaders and citizens, that moment was a bitter mirror of 1957. Now it was their turn to watch the other superpower claim a first that captured the imagination of the entire planet. From the American point of view, the narrative flips. What began as a Soviet demonstration that seemed to challenge U.S. superiority ended as an American demonstration that reasserted and expanded it. The country not only caught up, it surged ahead, building rockets, spacecraft, guidance computers, tracking stations, and training regimes at a scale and speed that left even the Soviet engineering establishment impressed and alarmed. The same system that had been mocked for making fancy car fins turned out to be capable of organizing thousands of companies and hundreds of thousands of workers into a single coordinated machine aimed at the moon. For American watchers of this story today, there is a familiar emotional echo. It is similar to the feeling when you hear how German generals in World War II reacted to American logistics, or how Japanese officers looked at U.S. carrier groups, shock turning into respect, and sometimes fear at the scale of American capability. In the Cold War's space race, the roles shifted back and forth, but the pattern is recognizable. Sputnik was the moment when Americans felt that jolt of the other side outran us. Apollo was the moment when Soviets had to swallow the realization that the technological gap had swung the other way, and perhaps even more dramatically. There is also curiosity in the details. How did a democracy, with all its competing interests, suddenly align enough resources to remake its education system, create NASA, and fund long-term basic research? How did engineers and scientists personally react to being told that their laboratory work was now on the front line of the Cold War? How did kids in 1958 feel when their math homework was framed as part of the answer to Sputnik? These are questions that humanize what could otherwise just be a list of acronyms and launch dates. For some Americans who lived through it, the memory of Sputnik is wrapped up with a sense of being challenged and then rising to that challenge. They remember the fear, yes, the dark jokes about missiles overhead, the anxiety about catching up with the Reds. But they also remember the excitement, the new science fairs, the rocket clubs, the televised launches from Cape Canaveral. They remember building model rockets in their garages, reading about astronauts, and feeling that their country was pushing forward into a future that would be written in stars and circuits, not just tanks in trenches. From the Soviet perspective, those same years had a different flavor. After the initial euphoria of Sputnik, the pressure mounted to keep up appearances of superiority. Each American success, especially once NASA hit its stride, pushed Moscow to attempt more complicated, riskier missions, sometimes with catastrophic failures kept secret or minimized at home. Inside the Kremlin, leaders understood that the technological contest carried not only military implications, but ideological. If American capitalism could reach the moon while Soviet socialism stalled in low Earth orbit, what did that say to the undecided nations of the world? That's the core of why this episode still resonates as a story of pride, fascination, and curiosity for an American audience. It shows how a moment of vulnerability, of feeling that someone else has leapt ahead, can become fuel. It shows how fear of being outclassed by a rival can be turned into an engine for reform in schools, ambition in laboratories, and investment in bold projects. It reminds viewers that American technological leadership, which so often seems like a given in hindsight, was built and rebuilt through crises, not handed down automatically.
When Americans today look up at GPS satellites guiding their phones, at weather images of hurricanes from orbit, at telescopes peering into deep space, they are looking at systems that trace their roots back to that night in 1957, when a small Soviet sphere beeped overhead. When they watch footage of Apollo landings, space shuttle flights, or modern private rockets landing themselves on drone ships, they are seeing the long echo of a competition that began with the shock of being second, not first. And when they picture Soviet officials in wood-paneled offices, eyes fixed on grainy black and white screens, showing American rockets rising, American capsules docking, American boots on lunar soil, they can feel that same emotional beat that so often appears in World War II stories. The rival who started strong, suddenly realizing that the United States has shifted into another gear. It is the moment when pride crosses the ocean in the form of raw capability, factories, universities, launch pads, code, and courage, and lands as shock on the other side. The story of Sputnik, then, is not simply a tale of American embarrassment. It is a two-act drama. In the first act, the Soviets left Americans staring at the sky, stunned that someone else was first. In the second act, the United States answered with a wave of science, engineering, and exploration so powerful that it forced the Soviets, in turn, to confront an American technological lead they could no longer deny. For viewers in the United States, that arc is what gives the narrative its emotional punch. The fear of falling behind, the determination to catch up, and the ultimate satisfaction of knowing that in the end, it was American rockets, American computers, and American know-how that defined where the frontier of space would be for decades to come.